Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Jamie Davis, and it's my privilege to organise these evening lectures, which are in our Changing World series. They are public lectures, and they're also taken by some of the undergraduates in the university as part of their course, which is why there was a course team you just saw. The lecture material is very wide-ranging. We go from natural sciences, law, the environment, many areas of life. And tonight, we are studying something which I suppose sits above almost everything because it's about knowledge itself. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Nick Traynor. Nick is a lecturer in philosophy in this university. He did his degree in Queen's University, Canada, and then a PhD in Brown University. He then moved to the University of Cambridge in England, where he was a fellow at Churchill College, and he was the Newton Lecturer in Philosophy. And in 2012, he joined this university as a Chancellor's Fellow, and now has a lectureship. There are many members of staff in this university, so it's a particular accolade when one of them, like Nick, has an award from the student body, in this case, an award for, let me get this right, the contribution to the student, to making an outstanding contribution to student experience. Those awards are very hard to come by, and congratulations on achieving one. I'm sure we'll understand by the end of the lecture how this was achieved. The floor is yours, Nick.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Jamie, and the other organizers for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming. It's a bit tricky with the bright lights in my face to see you, so I would normally want this to be quite conversational, but that might be hard to pull off. It feels much more like an inquisition, so we'll see how we get on. So the topic tonight, knowledge and its boundaries, is the title that I've given the talk. And boundaries was to fit with the general theme of the series. But I should start off by saying that what I have in mind by boundaries, we often think of boundaries as a sort of limit or a border or a barrier that we can't pass. And I don't mean that for the purpose of this talk. I don't think of boundaries, knowledge and its boundaries in that sense. I think of it rather to do with the extent of our knowledge. So the focus of the talk will be on how to understand the extent of our knowledge, and in particular how that expands. So just as we think boundaries and geographic boundaries can extend, we think our knowledge can extend further and further. And I've started the cover slide, this picture of this child, because I think it captures something that's very important about human curiosity. So this is a young child. He's kicked his boots off in the sand on the west coast of Scotland, and he's racing down to see what that big sea is there. And you know, that kind of delight in knowing and discovering is not something that all of us sustain through all our lives with the same kind of exuberance as a child, but I think it's something that is an essential part of being a person. And in some somewhat diminished sense, we all still have it as adults, and it's probably what drew, in some measure, it's what drew you here tonight. So you've come tonight, obviously, for different reasons, but some part of it has to do with this desire to know more, the same kind of desire that this child has. So knowledge and its boundaries. So what I want to do with this is just start off with with a very mundane or everyday observation as our starting point. Before I get into that, though, let me just say one thing more generally about the talk and how I'm approaching this as someone in philosophy. Philosophy is a bit tricky as a discipline because I can't, or people who do philosophy, we can't go out and do a bunch of research and find some cool things and then just come back and tell you about them. Partly that might be because we don't find out cool things, but I think that's not quite the right. We do. It's just that if the process of philosophy, if you just report on your findings, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't get any purchase. And I think that in many fields, you can understand, say, what a person is getting at without actually doing that, without doing the research yourself. And I think philosophy is quite different. And so what I would need to do in this talk is not sort of report on some research that I've done, but try to, in the time we have, the next 45 minutes or so, sort of do the research with you or try to get you into the same headspace that I've been in as I worked on this project. So I think for the most part it will be easy to follow. It might get a bit abstract at the end, but that just goes, I think, with the territory. But we start off with something very everyday. And this is just this unremarkable observation that how much we know seems like it can change. And I mean this in the most mundane sense that you can imagine. So if you just think, as an example, how much do I know? Well, it seems that I know more now than when I was 10 years old. I don't mean anything grand by how much we know we can change. I mean it in this quite basic and everyday sense. How much I know more now than when I was 10, and that's true of you. That's surely true of you. You must know more now than when you were 10. And this seems to be the case both individually and collectively. So I know more than when I was 10. I hope to know more in the future. You know more than when you were a child. You hope to know more in the future than you now know. That's all sort of true individually of each of us. But it also seems that how much we know collectively can change. So how much we as a society or as a civilization or how much humankind knows, it seems like that can change. And indeed it has. So how much we, say, have a civilization, to use that size of group, how much we know now compared to 3,000 years ago, it's enormous, enormously more than we know now. So it's a everyday observation. It's true individually and collectively. And it also seems true, what I'll call, both overall and with regard to specific subject matters. So I introduced this thought by just saying, I know more now than when I was 10, sort of overall. But it also seems true that we can know more and less about specific things or subjects. So as Jamie said, I came to Edinburgh in 2012. And when I came here for my interview, I knew something about Edinburgh, the city, and I know a lot more now. That just seems obvious after living here for 5 years. And think in your own case, I mean, no doubt there were times when you knew less about Edinburgh than you do now, but it seems like on almost any subject that you can think of, how much you know about that subject can change. So I take all this to be, these are all things that, what I'm saying so far is nothing new. I'm just drawing your attention to things that I think you've always known, that people have known as long as there's been people to know anything. Knowledge seems to, roughly speaking, knowledge seems to come in amounts, and how much you have of it can change. How much we have of it collectively can change, both both about specific subject matters and overall. So they're old, unremarkable claims, things you didn't need anyone to tell you, but they're no less timely for that. And let me say what I mean about that. Well, first of all, this idea that knowledge comes in amounts and that it can change how much you know, it's both a private and a public matter. It's a private matter in the sense that each of you, in some sense, cares very much about how much you know. Certainly, probably overall, I mean, hopefully overall, but certainly about specific subjects. So no matter what the subject is, there must be some subjects, presumably a great many, that each of you privately cares very much about. By private, I don't mean you hide from other people that you care about that, but just that it's a personal issue. It's a personal matter. It's also a public matter because if you just think of, say, where you are tonight at a university, enormous amounts of time and money, people's time and public money and private money are devoted exactly to the sort of thing we're talking about, which are increases in knowledge. So just because we're at the University of Edinburgh tonight, let's consider as an illustration of this the mission of the university, which is captured in this sort of pithy remark. The goal of the university is the creation, dissemination, and curation of knowledge. And this capture, each of these points is sort of deeply bound up with this idea that knowledge comes in amounts. So So the creation of knowledge, well, that's straightforward enough. What that's talking about is the research that takes place across the institution, the idea that the mission of the university is to sort of discover things that aren't known, that a year from now, there should be more known than there is now if the university meets this first part of its mission. So the creation of knowledge is about the discovery, about the increase of what's known. The dissemination is about the propagation of this knowledge, both the propagation of this new knowledge that's discovered, but also the propagation of what the academics and people teaching here have learned through their studies. So the university disseminates knowledge in the first instance to students. So you come here when you're a first-year undergraduate, and one of the goals of the university or its mission is for you to learn and increase what you know while you're here. And of course, I think the focus is principally on students, but the dissemination that the university has as its goal is much broader than that. But again, the idea there of dissemination is to increase not how much is known, say in general, with the creation or the research side of it, but with the dissemination side of it. And then with the curation, it's the same notion. Here, the idea isn't that it's trying to change the amount of knowledge by increasing how much is known or increasing how much people know. The notion of curation is that of protecting or preserving or safeguarding, keeping safe, that sort of notion. But that's still a notion of quantity, because the idea is the aim is to prevent the loss of. It's quite a remarkable thing if you think about it, that each of us comes into the world, lives however many years we do. We learn a great deal in the course of our lives. A great deal of that is very mundane, just matters about, we learn what kind of cereal we like, and we learn the petty and private cares, but then we also learn great truths about the universe and everything in between. But nonetheless, part of the mission of universities is to make sure that knowledge doesn't just reside in sort of mortals, but that it's preserved, it doesn't get lost. So I've spent some time thinking about this mission statement just because I think it illustrates the kind of the very public dimension to this question. All three aspects of the university's mission sort of rest on or involve this idea that knowledge comes in amounts and can grow and diminish. So what I want to look at, I said this is unremarkable, and by this idea is unremarkable. By that I just mean it's sort of a familiar point. It's the sort of thing that most of us would not normally have cause to notice or be puzzled about. But I think it's actually very, very puzzling if you try to think about what it involves or the right way to understand it. I put it sort of this way: what is it for a person's knowledge to increase or decrease? And for the purpose of the rest of the talk, I'll focus not on collective knowledge, but just on an individual person. So when your knowledge increases, either generally or with regard to a subject matter, what's happening there? What does that involve? I think this question can be easily misunderstood, so I'll say a bit more about what I have in mind. The question isn't about what brings about that change or what that sort of change enables. So if I'm asking you to think, or if I'm asking us in this time to think about what it is for a person's knowledge to increase or to decrease, and I say, well, what is that? What I'm wondering about is not the sorts of things you should do if you say want your knowledge to increase, or the sorts of things you should avoid doing. It's very easy to move immediately to that question when we think about what it is for a person's knowledge to increase. It would be easy to think, oh, well, that's a matter of studying a lot, or going out and seeing the world, or having new experiences, or meeting diverse people. And I think that's just a very different kind of question. That's a question about the sorts of things you should do if you want your knowledge to increase. It's not a question about what an increase in knowledge is. So I'll just say one other thing that may be clear, but because it's the sort of central question, I'll just give one more example of what I have in mind. You might think, or you could think, well, what is it for knowledge to increase, or how much knowledge do you have at a time, or which of us knows the most, something like that. You can imagine someone who tried to answer that question by saying something like, well, I don't think anyone would give this as an answer, but it illustrates the point. Imagine someone said, well, the person who knows the most, or knowing the most, or knowing more than, not say, other people, would be being able to win every pub quiz, something like that. So you could imagine the idea being that there's this test, say it could be a test in class, but think of it as a pub quiz, and if you could win every pub quiz, then you must be the one who knows the most. But that sort of answer is wrong. It's wrong for lots of reasons, but the most important reason it's wrong is because even if it's true that the person who knew the most would win every pub quiz, it seems like they would win every pub quiz because they knew the most. It wouldn't be that that's what the state of knowing the most or knowing more consisted in. And it's that latter question that I want us to try to get at. So what I'll do, going forward, what I'm going to do is first spend some time talking about what I think is the most, say, natural answer to this question. So the kind of question that if we were just chatting and I somehow brought up on the sly this problem and tried to get you to answer it without letting on what I was doing, the kind of answer I think you would be likely to give. Or the kind of answer that if we just thought about it by ourselves, we would find ourselves attracted to, at least initially. I'm going to lay out what that answer is, and then in the rest of the talk I'm going to focus on trying to say why I think that is wrong, or why that's not the right approach. So this very natural answer, a common answer, appeals to the idea that how much you know is a matter of the number of truths that you know, or the number of facts that you know. Now, I should say, you could imagine jumping in with, say, a kind of skepticism about these notions. So you might think, and some people do or say that they do, you might think, well, there's no such thing as truth, or what's a fact anyway? I'm just going to set those concerns aside. I'm going to assume for the purpose of this talk that some things are true and other things aren't. And so the problem I'm going to raise with this kind of approach isn't any sort of skepticism about some things being true and some things not being true. So with that sort of out of the way, we have this natural thing we could say. I want to indicate why I think this is natural. Think back to the example I gave that when I came to Edinburgh for my interview, I knew something about Edinburgh, but it seems true that now I know a lot more. If somebody said, prove that to me, or why should I think that that's true, or why do you think you know more about Edinburgh than you did 5 years ago? The natural thing to do, I think, would be to list a bunch of things that you now know, or that I now know that I didn't know then. So I'd say, well, of course I know a lot more about Edinburgh than I did 5 years ago. I know that Bristow Square, where the Philosophy building is, there used to be a street that ran through there. I know that the part of, what direction am I facing? North? Does anyone know right now? The part of the city that's immediately east of George Square and the George Square Lecture Theatre, I know that was the first bit of town to spill outside the walls, and that's why it looks a bit like Newtown. It's not organic the way Old Town is, but it has the sort of early Georgian structure. I know those two things, and it seems like I could just go on. I could list restaurants that I know Edinburgh has. I could list facts about the history of Edinburgh. It seems a natural thing to say if someone said, why do you think you know more about Edinburgh, would be to appeal to or list these number of facts. That also seems true generally. So if somebody just said, well, how much do you know? Not just about Edinburgh, but how much do you know in general? You might think that in principle you could list it. So you might say, if somebody said, what do you know? How much do you know? In no particular order. I might start off like this. I might say, so each of these are things that I know. I have a friend named Afan. Afan has a daughter. I've been using Afan for years in examples without his knowledge. That's also true. He wouldn't mind. That's, I hope, is true. No, I'm pretty certain that's true. He's an old friend from university. I'm in Edinburgh at the moment. So I'm just imagining that someone said, what do you know? How much do you know? And I'm just answering. I'm listing the things. I'm in Edinburgh. So are you. Afan isn't in Edinburgh. He's in Toronto, where he lives. His daughter lives there. So you can see this would just continue on and on. Eventually, the numbers would get higher and higher. I'd be into the millions. I'd get to this point. I know that if I went outside right now, we would probably see some stars. That might prompt me to remember this more interesting fact about stars. They're formed when massive clouds of molecular hydrogen collapse due to gravity. And I could just keep going and going. Maybe I'd get down to some truths like this that I learned someday, and so on. So it seems like if somebody said, how much do you know, or tell me what you know, it's easy to think that in principle there could be a list like this. And by in principle, I mean there would certainly be practical difficulties. You would sort of run out of time and energy and motivation and will to live and so on if you had to list them all. That certainly seems true. You'd make it, depending on who you are and how devoted you are to this task, you'd make it into the many thousands, but you'd give up before you finished. There's also the practical problem that it's almost certain that however diligent you approach the task, there'd be things that you forgot. Things you forgot to mention or to include. So you could imagine me devoting myself to this task, finally thinking the list was done, handing it in, and then only later thinking, oh, I forgot all that stuff about photosynthesis that I know, or something like that. So these are all practical problems that would prevent you from actually doing this. But they don't seem to be principled problems with the approach. It feels like, just like I could, in principle, list all the things about Edinburgh that I've learned and that I still know since I arrived here, there should be a list of all the things that I know in general. So I'm not sure if I've said enough. I mean, it's possible that laying it out like that makes you already start to wonder about this picture. But I hope the picture is attractive, this idea that this very natural way that we think of increasing knowledge is learning a greater, learning. We don't usually use words like we learned a greater number of facts or we increased the number of truths known. There's a certain kind of formality to that way of speaking that's unnatural, but we'd certainly say things like we learned more things. I learned more things about Edinburgh. And that's, I think, just a more vernacular way of saying I learned a greater number of truths. Now this is the picture that I'm going to try to argue is wrong, but before I do that I want to try to diagnose why I think it's so attractive, because I think that is part of where it goes wrong. And the diagnosis of why it's such a natural and attractive picture is that our sort of principal grasp on the idea of truth is through or via the notion of a declarative sentence. So here's what I mean by that. We think back to the question, your knowledge can increase. Well, what is that? Well, intuitively, the notion of knowledge increasing is the notion of something like getting more right. So in thought, we can get the world right, and we can get the world wrong. And when we get it right, that's knowing something. There's much more to say than this, but this is the basic notion. So we get the world right when we know. We get the world wrong if we believe something and the world's not that way. Knowledge is getting the world right. And the sort of principal way I think we have of thinking about what it is to get the world right is for something to be true. And the sorts of things that we're capable of thinking as true are the sorts of things that are expressed by declarative sentences. So just to give you an example of what I mean by that, think of each of these. Remember, I was imagining, when I introduced this slide, I described it as, I was sort of imagining it as a list of things that I know, or a list of the truths that I know. One truth I know, I have a friend named a fawn. A second truth, a fawn has a daughter. And of course, you don't know a fawn or his daughter or anything, so you're kind of taking my word for this. But the idea is that what I'm doing there is describing things that I believe and things that are true. So I'm describing beliefs that I have and sort of truths, or things that are true or truths. And the way I do that, in fact, it seems like the only way I can do that, or at least the principal way I can do that, is by using sentences, and in particular, declarative sentences. Sentences that end in a period, not a question mark, not an exclamation mark. Things that, very roughly speaking, say the world is some way. And it sort of makes sense that our grasp of truth and of belief is through this notion of a declarative sentence, exactly because, well, how would you describe what a declarative sentence is? You'd say something like, it's a sentence that says the world is some way. So if I say, do you have a friend named a fawn? I'm not saying something about the world, I'm asking about it. But if I say, I have a friend named a fawn, I'm saying something about the world. And of course, as soon as I say something about the world, that's when that's when the possibility arises of being right or wrong. If I don't say anything about the world, I'm never in error. But as soon as I say the world is some way, I might be right or I might be wrong. So truth and belief is our sort of principal way of making sense of the idea of getting the world right, and our grasp on those notions conceptually is sort of through this notion of a sentence. And so I think if we go back to the question of what is it for knowledge to increase, one of the reasons is very natural to think that the answer is a kind of enumerative answer, is exactly because we would express our knowledge through expressing sentences of this form. So I think that's part of why the answer is attractive, but I think it's also closely connected to why it's wrong. And so what I'll do is I want to sort of run through two reasons for thinking the argument's wrong. Two reasons for thinking that this approach is wrong. The approach that says an amount of knowledge is some number of truths. The first of those, so there's sort of be two lines of argument. The first line of argument tries to discredit the idea that how much you know can be understood as some number of truths at all. That's the aim of the first argument. And the aim of the second argument is to just sort of set that aside and raise an independent concern that even if what you know can be understood as some number of truths, that number doesn't capture the quantity that you know. So I'll sort of run through each of those in turn. So first, the first argument that says what you know can't be properly understood as some number of things that you know. Well, I'll use this example of a fawn having a daughter to get us started. Remember that on our list, this was one truth that I know. But we can start to see that there's something going amiss if we imagine that I could also have written on my list this: a fawn has a daughter and a son. That could have been, 112 or something. Or that could have been number one instead of a fawn has a daughter. That was number one. And the point of this, of introducing, or the point I'm trying to get at here is that assume for the sake of argument that a fawn has both a daughter and a son. Each of these is one truth in a manner of speaking, But they don't seem to be, roughly speaking, they don't seem to be the same amount of truth. Or to maybe put that a different way, suppose I know that a fawn has a daughter, but you know a fawn has a daughter and a son. Seems like you know more than me, even though we each know one truth about a fawn. Now, at that point, I think it'd be the right thing to do is object and say, no, there's some sleight of hand going on here. It's true that each of those is one truth, but the second is not merely one truth. It's more something like two truths. So it is right to say it is a truth that a fawn has a daughter and a son. But it's not exactly one truth or merely one truth. It kind of packages up, the sentence packages up a couple of truths. So if I had written a fawn has a daughter and a son as one of the truths I know, it seems like the right thing to say is, that's two truths, they need separate lines on that list, or you're not counting properly. Now if we just stop there, if the problem was only that some of our beliefs or some truths have this very obvious conjunctive structure with the word and in the expression of it, then it would be quite an easy problem to resolve. Once you had that list, you'd look through it, and wherever there was an and, you'd erase the and have a new line for the second part of the sentence. But the problem is this is just scratching the surface. This example just scratches the surface of the general problem, which we can see if we use these examples. So remember that each of these was sort of one item on my list of truths that I know. And neither has the word and, neither has the word and anywhere in it. The first one might look like it has and because it has x is so and so many, but ignore that. It could be grain of sand x is 15 millimeters or 38 millimeters. So neither has the word and in it. So neither of those truths is like the a fawn has a daughter and a son truth in the sense of having an obvious conjunctive structure that should occupy two different lines on the list. But if you think about them, though, it still seems they have, what we would roughly speaking call the surface grammar of the sentence hides complexity. So here's what I mean. Think of the truth that stars are formed when massive clouds of molecular hydrogen collapse due to gravity. That's a truth, but it seems to, metaphorically speaking, contain or involve or be bound up with or carry with it, some notion like that, a lot of truth. For instance, that stars are formed, that they're formed from clouds of molecular hydrogen, that they're formed from clouds of molecular hydrogen that have collapsed, and probably even other truths like molecular hydrogen sometimes form clouds. Some things collapse sometimes. There is such a thing as molecular hydrogen, and so on. So it seems like the sentence that we wrote on our list captures a truth, but it's like the a fawn has a daughter and a son truth in the sense that it's not exactly one truth. It's a truth, but in a sense in name only. It carries with it or involves or brings with it something like a lot of truth, even though it doesn't have this very obvious conjunctive structure. I think the same would be true of anything we wrote on the list, but just to give another example, something like grain of sand X is 30 millimeters from grain of sand Y. It seems like the most natural way to understand what that truth is, what that sentence says, or what that truth is, would be something like X is a grain of sand, Y is a grain of sand, and X is so and so many millimeters from Y. And it seems that sort of can be understood as something like X exists and Y exists, and X is a grain of sand. So all I'm doing here is taking this sentence and sort of trying to rewrite it in a different vocabulary. And where the point of the problem, or the point of doing that, is to reveal that it's quite unclear how many truths it sort of really is. There's a sense, it is true that it's, say, one truth, but it's also true that it's 3, or it's true that it's 5. So if we think that how much we know can be given by this sort of exhaustive enumeration of what we know, we're going to need some sort of principled reason for deciding to count, say, that truth as 1 or 3 or 5 or whatever on our list. Now at this point we might just think, okay, but this merely helps us refine our understanding of what we need to do. And what we can see we need to do is think really carefully about what we write down. And don't write sentences like, a fawn has a daughter and a son. Don't write sentences like, stars are forming massive clouds, and so on, because that sort of sneaks in a lot of truth where we want just one. But the problem with doing that is that, the problem with responding by thinking this merely helps us out by making more clear what we need to do, is that when we think about it more, or when we sort of continue to think about it, what we should see is it's not just a matter of the sort of surface grammar of the sentence hiding complexity, as is plausibly what happens in these cases. It's that the sort of vocabulary of language itself hides complexity. So here, to give you an illustration of what I mean by this, I'll use an example that we've already talked about, this example of the truth that a fawn is a daughter and a son. Remember when I brought this up, the thought was, well, it's very natural to think that, well, a fawn is a daughter and a son. Yes, that's one truth, but it's not just one truth, it's really two truths, kind of packaged up as one, is what I'd said. And I take it that most of you might have accepted that and said, yes, that's really two truths there, packaged up as one. But the problem is, think about just the first of those alleged two truths, that a fawn has a daughter. That seems also to package up a lot of truth. It seems to package up the truth that a fawn has a child X and X is female. Here, it's not a matter of the sort of surface grammar of the sentence hiding a conjunction. It's a matter of the predicate, has a daughter, not picking out one property of a fawn, but picking out a property that's complex in its nature. So this is an example that just has to do with I'm using the notion of a daughter to make the point, but it's a pervasive feature of language. It's not something about daughters that they're complex. It's that it seems like any word that we could think of that we would use in making that list of things that we know would have this kind of feature. It would be like the word daughter. So let me just say a couple other things to illustrate this. Again, very mundane examples. Think about how in English, this kind of peculiar feature of English that think of words for relatives. So uncle, aunt, niece, nephew, those words in English mark the gender of the person. I'm trying to think, there's not a generic word. Think of how the word sibling is generic for brother or sister. I don't think in English there's a generic word, or at least not a well-known one, or at least not one that I know, for a niece or nephew, but where the gender is not marked. I don't think that's right. There's not one, is there? So, but notice the word cousin. So in English, we don't mark the gender of cousins. So I don't know why we don't, but we don't. Other languages do. So the point of this example is, if I want to express, so I have a nephew named Finn. Think of the state of affairs that consists of me having a nephew. So I stand in a certain relation to my sister, she stands in a certain relation to him, and he's, say, male. Now, English permits me to express that complex relation to him and his gender with a single word, nephew. We easily could speak a language where I couldn't do that, where I'd have to say, I have a such and such, and he is male. Just like I have a cousin, I have a female cousin, and I can't in English express that with one word. I'd have to say, I have a cousin, and she is female. So I picked this as an example just because it's quite obvious that we can all relate to it, and because it illustrates the sort of arbitrariness of how much the words that we have available to us say about the world. So we express ourselves in words, and for all kinds of complicated sociological, etymological, who knows the full explanation, words compress different amounts of information, and it seems very arbitrary how much the mapping between a word and how much it says about the thing that's being talked about seems very arbitrary. Now, some of this, this is actually a really crucial feature of language. Some of this we could get rid of. So you could easily imagine deciding, I'm not going to use gendered words for nieces and nephews or aunts and uncles. I'm going to use some non-gendered word. We could easily do that. And then we could strike that word from our language, and then if we did want to indicate, if we did want to say what we can now say by saying, I have an aunt, we just have to express ourselves at greater length, we could do that. But one thing that we can't do is do that across the board. So we couldn't, it seems completely impossible to imagine a language that we could speak that would not compress loads of information about things. I think that's true even if we just think of things like daughter, child, niece, and nephew. It's certainly true if we think about things like stars are formed when massive clouds of molecular hydrogen collapse due to gravity. Each of those words packs in loads of information. So molecular hydrogen, well, that packs in a lot. Collapsing due to gravity, that packs in a lot. And it seems impossible to imagine that we could, so to speak, decompose that sentence into a vocabulary where the terms in the language say exactly one thing about what they're talking about rather than a lot. I hope that sort of makes sense, what I have in mind by that. So how to sum up that idea? Well, the thought that I've been getting at is roughly this. Singleness of a sentence is one thing, singleness of what the sentences express is quite another. So if we think back to that list that we started with, where we're imagining it's a list of the number of things that I know. Even if we could make such a list, it seems like what that list, all we would get, what we could, in principle, maybe get a list of is the number of sentences that we could use to express what we know or to express the truth that we know. But it would seem arbitrary. There wouldn't be the right kind of relationship between the number of such sentences and the number of truths that those sentences sort of capture or encompass. And it's the latter that we would need, not the former. So this is the sort of first line of argument, is to say it's very natural to think that an amount of knowledge is some number of truths. That's natural in the sense that most of us, I think, would say that sort of thing if pressed, but it's also natural because of this deep relationship between truth and language. But it's that very same deep relationship that shows this idea is probably not workable. As I said, each of these things carries with it a lot of information. So that's the sort of first argument, and the point of it, obviously I've had to sketch it imperfectly here, but the point of it is just to try to say it's an illusion to think, well, to say either it's an illusion to think that we could count truths, or at best what we could count is some way of expressing them rather than some sort of privileged, fully exhaustive decomposition of them. So counting is not going to work, or counting is impossible, roughly speaking. But now I want to try to run the second kind of argument, which sort of sets aside those concerns. So let's just ignore those, pretend we didn't even hear of them. Can we give another argument that how much you know is not a matter of how many truths you know? I think we can do that if we imagine two people, or two people who believe the same number of truths in some intuitive sense, setting aside the problems I've just raised, but where it seems like intuitively they differ greatly in how much they know. So we're going to imagine two people, they know the same number of things, to use that expression, but one of them intuitively knows a lot more. If that's possible, then how much you know and how many things you know just come apart. And I think it is possible. So here are the two people that we're going to imagine. So first there's Smith, and Smith, I've said here, knows everything in the Encyclopedia Britannica. The exact example doesn't matter. The idea is that picture Smith is someone who picture some large body of knowledge like the Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia or all the nonfiction books in the University of Edinburgh Library, something like that. And we're imagining a person who knows everything that's in them. And by here, I don't mean they know what's in the books, in the sense if you said to them what's in that book, they could tell you. You could do that without necessarily knowing the things that are in the books. So you might know that the book, that might sound confusing, but the basic idea is that knowing that such and such is in the book is not the same thing as knowing that such and such. So you might, because you might be like, well, I know this is in the book, but is it true? What I'm imagining is not that Smith knows what's in the encyclopedia, but rather all the stuff that's in the encyclopedia is stuff that Smith knows. So that's Smith. The Encyclopedia Britannica, of course, I'm imagining the vast multi-volume thing that probably isn't even published anymore. And now we're contrasting her with this person, Jones. And Jones, I'm imagining, knows all the truth, or I shouldn't say knows all the truths, knows, let's say, a great many of the truths that describe distance relation between points on some line. So the point of what this example is getting at is we have a first person who knows kind of like all the stuff that science has discovered and the historians know, blah, blah, blah. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that adds up to 1 billion facts, or 2 billion facts. Smith knows 2 billion facts of the kind that's in the encyclopedia. And we want to imagine someone who knows exactly as many facts, but they're just of a different character. And this is our second person. And the character of the facts that Jones knows are like this. This point is so and so many millimeters from that point. And by points, I'm just thinking of a line in space that, I guess some of this depends on whether you think space is continuous or has smallest units. None of that really matters for the purposes. The point is, there's certainly more than 1 billion of the points in an inch. And somehow Smith has the capacity, Jones has the capacity to name points and to say how far apart they are. Again, the exact example doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's an inch versus a meter and so on. The idea is just that we want there to be a pairing between the number of truths that Smith knows and the number that Jones knows. And I think if you think about this case, obviously these people are quite fanciful. None of us are like that. No doubt no human could be like that. Those are bits of the example I think we can set aside. Maybe no people could be like this, but think of some possible being with cognitive powers greater than our own that meet this situation. Now it seems like if we imagine this and we say, which of these two beings knows more, I think the right intuitive answer to that, just what our sort of heart tells us, so to speak, or our gut, is that Smith knows more. Now I think that if you read into the question who knows more, if you sort of interpret that question as meaning which knows a greater number of facts, you of course won't think Smith knows more. You'll say it's just built into the example that they know the same amount. But I think if you do that, you're sort of, if you do that, you're importing a theoretical answer to the question of what it is to know more without really recognizing that you are. So it can be a bit confusing. So all I mean by that is if your reaction to this question, if I say, which of these people knows more, and if you say, what are you talking about? You've just said they know the same amount. If you have that reaction, it's because you're sort of hearing the question, who knows more, as sort of just meaning the same thing as who knows a greater number of truths. Now, it might be that they know the same amount, but if that's right, that's because the right answer to the question, how much do you know, is an answer that appeals to the number of truths known. But that would be a kind of theoretical account. They wouldn't be synonymous. So I think in this case, if you think about it, I think the right thing to think is that Smith knows more. And the reason for that, very roughly speaking, I'll give another example in a minute that I think is more intuitive. But very roughly speaking, the thought is Smith seems to have a pretty good picture of what the world is like. To be sure, there's lots that she gets wrong, or sorry, maybe I shouldn't say, there's lots that she doesn't. There's lots of aspects of the picture that are missing, that are vague, that are not filled in. But overall, I think intuitively, she's a pretty good picture of the way the world is. The other Jones person it seems like the right thing to think is that he's sort of completely in the dark about what the world is. He knows all kinds of stuff about what these points on the line are like, but is almost completely clueless about what the world is like. Let me try making the same argument, but with an example not of knowledge overall, but knowledge of a specific subject matter, because I think the intuition is even clearer then. So the thought is, think of the subject matter apples. And by this I don't mean some particular apple or some particular group of apples I might have, but just think apples in general. And again, we're going to imagine two people who we're going to stipulate have the same number of true beliefs about apples, but where intuitively it seems like one of them has a really good idea of what apples are, and one of them hasn't a clue what apples are. So the first person, they know everything in the Encyclopedia Britannica, or what you will, about apples. So they know all kinds of biological facts about apples, about their history, about how they're related to blossoms, how they're related to future apple trees, about how they've evolved. They know chemical facts about, I don't know much about apples, so it's hard for me to fill this in, but they know the sugar levels of apples and how much fiber they have and what material they're made out of and why they're different colors, and they know all of that. And if anyone here is an apple expert, you can kind of you can imagine filling in the details. Imagine the first person knows all of that. And the second person knows exactly as many things about apples, but they're all of this character. So they just can arbitrarily pick out random points in space, and they know no apple has a center of gravity here, no apple has a center of gravity there, and so on. And again, we're imagining that there's a sort of perfect mapping for every belief that the first person has about apples, the second person has one to match. Again, we're setting aside that first problem I raised. Now, I think if we think about this, in a sense, this case is just like the first case I talked about, where the one person knew everything in the encyclopedia and the other knew everything about these points in a line, except it's restricted to not to the world in general, but to a specific topic like apples. And I think if we think about this case, what we'll conclude is that the first person knows a lot about apples. They're very good at telling the difference between apples and other things. If you were going to trick them by giving them something that wasn't an apple, it would have to be something that was very, very, very similar to an apple in order for them to be tricked, so on. So these are all different ways of capturing this idea that they know a lot about apples. Whereas it seems like the second person, they know as many truths about apples as you please, but it seems like they have no clue what apples are. They're completely in the dark. For all they know, just look at any random set of objects around you. For all they know, any of those things could be an apple. Now, if this argument is right, it's again putting pressure on this idea that how much you know or an amount of knowledge is some number of truths. So just to kind of wrap up, what I want to just gesture towards, I won't say anything in detail about it, is what I think would be a sort of better direction to go in. So up to now, the thought has been knowledge seems to come in amounts. It seems like we can know more and less. This seems to be something we're deeply committed to. It's a private, personal matter, but it's also a matter of great public interest or relevance. And the natural way of thinking of it is that how much a person knows is a matter of the number of truths they know. And I've tried to say that's not right for two reasons. One is it probably doesn't make sense at the end of the day that a person knows some number of truths at all. And then the second argument is even if they do, even if I've been wrong about that and they do, it still seems that the sort of quantitude structure of what's true isn't captured by the number of truths. It seems to come apart. And what I think, where I think we should look to, for the right answer to the question what it is to know more, is to the general notion of similarity. To illustrate what I mean by that, think about those two bottles and say this cup. It seems that so we would normally think that these cups are more similar to each other than either is to this. Sorry, these bottles are more similar to each other than either is to this cup. But when we think about it, that seems to be not just a matter of the number of properties they have in common, but certain properties that they have in common making more of a difference to similarity. So, for instance, I'm kind of making this up on the spot. These bottles share a certain shape property, and they share the property of being made of plastic. But this and this share the property of being closer to this, or being less than 8 inches from this. And let's just stipulate, or let's just imagine that this and this share the property of having an even number of molecules. Not the same number, but just an even number, whereas this we might imagine has an odd number. Now it seems like the right thing to think about that is to say, okay, so sure, these things share those two properties, and these things share those two properties. But the property of having a certain shape and the property of being made of plastic makes for much greater similarity between the objects. Whereas the property of being less than 8 inches from this makes for almost no similarity at all. Similarly, the property of having an even number of molecules in itself makes for almost no similarity at all. So I think if we think about similarity between objects, it's quite natural to think that some properties make a greater contribution to similarity than others, or sharing some properties makes a greater contribution to similarity than others. And I think it's the very same thing is what we should think in the case of an increase in knowledge. After all, how much one knows, I think this is a natural thought, is a matter of the similarity between your representation of something and that thing that you're representing. So it just seems intuitively that knowing more about something is a matter of improving or increasing the similarity or the fit between your picture of the thing and the thing. And so the way those thoughts come together is that just as similarity between objects is a matter not of how many properties they have in common, but of which properties, where discerning or sort of sharing certain properties makes for a much greater degree of similarity than sharing other properties. I think the very same thing we should think about knowing, that representing of an object certain of its properties increases your knowledge of it much more than representing others. So that answer, if something along this line is right, that would be compatible with, you might remember that when I was arguing against the idea that how much you know is a matter of the number of truths you know, I gave those two arguments, one that said truths aren't countable, the other that said even if they are, it's the wrong answer, it doesn't work for other reasons. The kind of answer that I favor, this appeal to this notion of similarity, would be compatible with sort of either of those. So if it's true that the number of, or sorry, whether or not it's true that the number of truths aren't countable, the story I'm advocating in the briefest of ways right now works. And I think it fits very naturally with the second kind of argument I gave, in the sense that the problem with the person, if you think about the Apple example, the problem with the person who had tons of beliefs about the apples, but they were all about where their centers of gravity were, is that that person was not picking out properties of the apple that contribute to it being the kind of thing it is. Whereas the person who had the beliefs about the encyclopedia, the encyclopedia style beliefs about the apples, the reason she counted by virtue of those beliefs as knowing a great deal about apples was exactly because she was picking out or discerning properties of the apple that make it the thing that it is, or the kind of thing that it is. So that's the conclusion. So thank you.
Well, maybe this is a little bit awkward question, but I was thinking about the consequences of the argument. I understand that it is a really technical argument, and but it is really interesting the part where you say that it is not about the number of the truths or facts that you can know, where you can compare some situations if you have more knowledge or than other person. But what happens if you use this kind of argument to establish some sort of hierarchical behavior? Because you can say, in the example of the encyclopedia, you have, well, it is not the same to know about the encyclopedia, but to know about this really particular stuff. But you can imagine an example where a person is knowing something, a genius in one discipline and a genius in another discipline, and say, okay, I know a lot about stuff in my discipline, and the other person says, I know a lot of things about my discipline. Say, well, but I am a physicist. I know in physics, so I mean the prestige of the discipline tends to be more like it is not the same to know a lot with all the respect.
Be careful what subject you say.
This is the idea.
Now.
It is not the same to know a lot in law that a guy who knows a lot in physics. Or you can have the same argument between cultures. Say that, well, within this context, these people know about how to use practical knowledge, whatever, and not specifically in modern science knowledge. And in maybe just the last one, the difference between theoretical and practical knowledge. Because it is really interesting how you say about the thing that we are here in the university to be in touch with knowledge. And then sometimes when you are out of the university, you get into not the real world, but the world outside the university, and you realize that actually you don't know anything. You have to know again in another context. So.
Okay, so I think let me take a stab at that. So as I understand the question, there's sort of a kind of general worry that expresses itself in three ways. The first thought is something like, we can easily imagine two people who both know a lot in the same kind of way about different subject matters, say biological facts and physics, physical facts, or law, or economics, or whatever. And the worry was that does that sort of require us or force us into some kind of view of some disciplines as, I'm not sure exactly what the worry is, but maybe more important or fundamental or something. I thought that was the one thought. And then the idea being that that same kind of worry could, might also find expression worrying about things that different cultures value, or there's a kind of, perhaps a privileging of a certain kind of theoretical knowledge that people focus on at universities over what happens in the non-real world, but the outside of the university. So I think that that's a really interesting question, and I think that, in a sense, it's exactly right that kind of stuff is at issue. So really, suppose that, broadly speaking, some kind of approach is right that says some properties of an object differ, such that some are more central to its identity, and knowing those is a way of counts for, or sort of makes you know the object better. That's in a sense what the picture is. And I think it's a consequence of that some sciences in the broadest sense might be more fundamental than others. I mean, naming names, I don't think that's the right kind of thing to do now, not for the risk of offending people, but because it would be quite a tricky thing to sort out which sciences in the broad sense pick out properties that are more or less fundamental to a thing. But that there are ways of thinking about the world that get at its sort of deepest nature, that there are ways of thinking about the world that get at the world's deepest nature more profoundly than others, I don't think, I think it would be hard to resist that thought. So one of the things that would need to be sorted out is how to decide what sorts of properties are those that are more central to a thing's being the kind of thing it is. But I think that's something that we just want to discover anyways, and we are already, quite independently of the topic of this thought, we think is the case. So I think if we just think about anything, we think we have in our heads some kind of very crude taxonomy of facts about it, where some of them seem more central to its being the kind of thing it is. So that a tree is in the exact location in my yard that it is not at all relevant, really, to it being a tree or a tree of that kind or anything like that. But then there are other things about that tree that are sort of bound up with it being the kind of thing it is. So just to wrap this up, because I want to hear other questions, I think that some of that we would want to embrace. I don't think it means that that means you have to sort of crudely run roughshod over other perspectives. But in a sense, I would kind of embrace the thing that you're worried about. Just think that it needs to be handled properly, like it has to be sorted out carefully.
So thanks a lot for the very good talk. I'm trying to formulate this in a clear way. So I agree with the idea completely, with the idea that the breadth of about what we know about something matters, and that not, let's say, all the knowledge is equivalent, because the guy that knows all the points in a line probably knows very little compared to Smith, in the sense that like it just doesn't have a wide appreciation of what that line is, etc., etc. When it comes to, however, quantifying the knowledge, so merely making a count of how many facts, your argument has been that's not countable. We cannot count how many facts we know. And my question is, wouldn't it, because when we say stars are made of hydrogen, every time there is an hidden truth behind, and there are a number of layers that are potentially infinite, or at least it would seem so, because the number of deeper layers are so many. Like when we say hydrogen, we should describe hydrogen as, whatever, like has the element that binds to oxygen and creates water and blah 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 blah. On the other hand, that's a very complicated mechanism to try to disentangle it when we take a fact and we try to break it down into smaller pieces. But what if we do the opposite process? That is, we consider everything we know about hydrogen as a process since we were born. Every day we studied and read a new page about hydrogen in our chemistry textbook, then we put a tick about one thing that we know. In that way, the level of complexity that the word hydrogen seems to imply seems to fade apart because the process is so much more progressive. In that sense, don't you think is a controversy to say that we cannot that we cannot say how many things we know about the thing, even though the things that we know about the thing has been acquired one after another?
So can I just clarify, I understand the thought. Is the thought that it's true that if right now you have to try to take something you know and figure out how many truths or things you know go into that, it would be hard. But if you've been sort of keeping track all along from like day one, then you wouldn't have that problem.
Yeah.
It's basically the idea. So the thought is, it's difficult, but it's difficult, or that I think the way of putting it in a more pointed way as a criticism would be to say, I'm confusing a kind of difficulty now in discerning these things that go into it. I'm mistaking that for a kind of fundamental problem with the possibility of it being done. So yeah, here's why I don't think that's really the case. The way you're imagining it was this person who, I mean, I chuckled when you said it because that person sounds so funny, but the person who like every day of their life, they like read one page of the chemistry book. But what you're imagining there, what you're trying to capture is the idea that each day they learn one fact or whatever about hydrogen or whatever we're talking about. And the way I can imagine a person who every day wakes up and, as different as this person is from us, but every day wakes up, reads one fact about hydrogen, so to speak. But what I can't really imagine is I can't really make sense of what that one fact is that on the story you're telling they would be learning. So when I think about what it is, it always seems to me to look, roughly speaking, like the "if Fawn has a daughter" fact. It seems, whatever I'm imagining you're reading each day, it seems to have this kind of complexity built into it. Now, some of that is just a claim on my behalf because we're not actually looking at what these examples are, so in a sense we'd have to see them. But one way and so you might say, well, this is a really hard thing to sort out because unless we knew what this textbook looked like. But here's a reason I think to think that anything that was in that textbook would have to have this kind of complexity. So day one, you open the textbook and it says hydrogen it says something about it. Now for your story to work, the thing that it says about hydrogen has to be sort of like exactly one. It can't smuggle in a bunch of stuff. The worry is, how can I understand what's being said about hydrogen on that page unless it tells me that hydrogen is some way? So for me to understand that, I have to be like, aha, hydrogen is this way, whatever way that is. And it's hard to make sense of what a way is without imagining something being true, something that, so if it says hydrogen is phi, if I'm just using the term phi as an adjective, hydrogen is phi, I have to understand what phi-ness is. So phi-ness has to have something like a definition. And that seems to be the kind of complexity. So that's, I mean, I don't think we can sort out whether...
But is it just complex or is it impossible?
Sorry?
Is this just complex or is it impossible? Like, you need to understand what phi is, and that's a complex issue, but is it impossible?
Oh, sorry, by complex what I meant was, I didn't mean difficult, what I meant was, either you were saying, right now if we try to think about what we mean by hydrogen, we get lost and we can't spell it all out. But I thought you were saying, but imagine that we kept track as we went, and each day we said, okay, that's one more thing, two things. Now I'd be like, well, yes, I know what hydrogen consists in. It's like these 512 things. And I took that to be the response, and my response was to say, the worry I have with that kind of approach is that I can't none of the sort of single things that we're being asked to imagine we learn can I make sense of as being genuinely single. I can't make sense of them unless they kind of smuggle in a kind of broader description. Maybe that's something that reasonable people could continue to think about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mine was sort of in the overall context in terms of education. So when children are taught very early on, they're often taught on fact-based knowledge, and with all sort of the information that you've talked about today, how will that change, do you think, sort of going forward, the way that people are taught and the way that knowledge changes? It's already changed from my parents' generation, where my mum would always say she has greater what is termed general knowledge or pub quiz knowledge, because that's how they were taught at school. That's now not the way it's taught, because our concept of knowledge and how to quantify that knowledge has changed. How do you kind of foresee, in the way that you described it today, knowledge changing in the way that we're educated about things, or the way that people...
Okay, so just as a brief answer to that, it reminds me of something that as partial answer to your question, it reminds me that the first question, I raised that issue that, well, what about when you leave the university and you sort of realize you don't know anything? And I neglected to say that I think it's important that we remember to distinguish, or we remember that learning has many, many aims. One aim is just to learn more or to learn the kind of fundamental natures of things. But that's certainly not, that's just one aspect of what we care about and say what our educational system should be devoted to. And by that I mean, here's something that we should all know, even though, from the perspective of the universe, it's a very trivial fact, which are, what time is your bus? What time is the last train home? So there's all kinds of practical matters that we need to know just to get by in life that are not theoretical knowledge. And I think those come apart. And in relation to your question, I think that it's important to remember that an educational system should have lots of aims. One of them might be something like increasing the amount that we know. I think that the broad topic of this is relevant to educational systems, partly in the sense that I think a better understanding of the right way to understand increases of knowledge would be one that gives a proper weight to certain kinds of theoretical understanding. And this is not a comment that like 5-year-old or like kids in grade 5 should be learning physics or science. I mean, those are more complicated matters, but it would be easy to think, I think both from a research perspective and from an educational perspective, there's a story that would need to be told about why certain kinds of research or certain kinds of theoretical knowledge is important. And you could, absent this kind of story, you might just say, well, we need students to learn a lot. They all need to learn 1,000 facts by the time they graduate. And if you say these facts are more important than those facts, that's just, that's problematic for the kinds of reasons the first question identified. But if the reason these facts are more important is because knowing them increases your knowledge more, then I think we have a sort of theoretical story for why certain kinds of research or certain kinds of learning is more fundamental. But with a caveat that education has many aims and not all of it is to increase knowledge.
I'd like to finish by thanking Nick again for a very good
Thank you.